Hello, everybody. Welcome to the fifth installment of Fault Injection. And I'd like to introduce myself again. I'm Chris Clark, Principal Security Engineer at Synopsys.
And I'm Robert Vamosi, CISSP and Security Strategist at Synopsys.
Today we're going to be carrying on our discussion about cyber supply chain. This has been a topic we've talked about multiple times related to defense industry and other areas, but today we're going to talk about the automotive industry and the supply chain and some of the challenges that are related to that.
So let's start with a little bit of history, because when we think of medical devices, when we think of other industries, they've had years to ramp up on all of this.
Sure.
But relatively speaking, the automotive industry was quietly going along, not really thinking about software, and then there was this event that occurred in the summer of 2015 where a Jeep went off the road and it was remotely controlled. And suddenly the automotive industry woke up to the fact that, wow, there's a few million lines of code going on in that vehicle, and some of that is vulnerable.
Well, and I think the other thing to take into account is it hasn't stopped.
Right.
Even though we had that seminal event that really kind of kicked this off, when we look at other manufacturers out there, they're starting to see these challenges as well, and it's starting to grow and grow. Just like what we've seen in medical, when we have ransomware attacks that are attacking medical delivery organizations. We've seen malware infection. Some other interesting challenges have been coming up recently. And the automotive industry really is playing catch-up. But I will say the automotive industry is running really fast to catch up.
I was going to add that. I think the way in which they've embraced the seriousness of this is just remarkable. Mm-hmm. And the way that they are tackling it is just inspiring in some ways. They've convened various bodies to look at standards. They've engaged the software industry to promote and help them get to that next level. And they've worked with their supply chain. Mm-hmm. They've always had a tight control over their supply chain. Exactly. When there's an auto accident or something, they're able to go back and say that this part was manufactured on this day and had this problem, and in some cases have to do a recall because of that. And because of that scrutiny of the supply chain, they're applying that now to the software industry.
Right. And that recall process that you mentioned is a very robust process, right? So when we talk about whether it's a recall for an individual component in a vehicle or a subsystem of components in a vehicle, it's very clear which parts that need to be replaced, what the process is for going through that, and addressing that particular issue. But cyber adds a new characteristic that we haven't seen. And this is where the industry is really asking for a lot of input in how we can address these particular challenges and these particular issues. So I'm very lucky. I get to work with ISO and the SAE, different working groups related to cybersecurity and cyber challenges. But there's a wide range of people that are participating in these organizations, not only the OEMs, but also the Tier 1 and Tier 2 and component manufacturers that provide components to the automotive industry. And every single one of them is asking, what should we do? Where is the standard? What are the standards that we need to follow? And it has proven to be rather challenging because when we think about these standards, it's not an issue of I need to address the standard for right now. I need to address a standard that's going to last for the next 5 to 7 years and also be flexible enough that it can grow with the type of technologies that we're looking at going into vehicles.
There's also a paradigm shift, to use a cliche term, where they've focused on the safety of the vehicle. And they're used to regulations, they're used to standards that focus on the safety of the vehicle. But the security part of it hasn't been in there necessarily, hasn't been called out specifically. Right. Are you finding that to be true?
Yes, and I think that's why we've seen ISO 26262 become so prevalent in the industry. When we look at this particular standard, its focus is safety. When we look at J3061, that focus is cybersecurity and how we address that. And what we're really looking at and where the direction that we're going is how do we merge those two? They'll never be one single document, but they all work together. When we look at a vehicle, we're looking at quality, we're looking at safety, and we're looking at security, especially as we become more connected. Mm-hmm. When we look at a vehicle, the vehicle of 10 years ago that had an engine and it had some ECUs, a couple of controllers to manage that engine and the system in the vehicles, that's gone. Even in today's vehicles, we look at very well-connected systems, even talking back to the manufacturers or the OEMs so that they can maintain that fleet over time.
But perhaps we should step back and explain that a little bit. Unlike other devices that we work with, there's no homogeneous operating system going on here. There are the electronic controllers that you refer to, the ECUs, that are running the anti-lock brakes or the steering column or even the infotainment system, the heating and air conditioning, all of that. They're very separate systems, and they use a CAN bus system to communicate with one another. Right. More or less.
More or less, yeah. And they use multiple systems to communicate. It's not just that one CAN bus, but that's the one most people are very familiar with, and how many attacks that are in vehicle are actually applied. So it's a very critical subsystem of our overall vehicle. But I think a common misconception for many people is that when they look at a vehicle, each one of these components has its own operating system, and that's not necessarily the case.
Right.
We may have an ECU that is running just a chunk of code and no true operating system. It's performing a very specific action, performs it very quickly, and the ability to subvert that particular component may be more challenging, but it could be used as a pivot point or some other activity within a vehicle to become part of that overall attack.
Right, and the lack of an overall operating system is actually beneficial because that speaks to something we talk a lot about in security, which is partitioning or segmenting off different units. And so that infotainment unit, which is connecting to the internet and which is connecting to Spotify and Pandora and whatever, is not necessarily connecting to the steering column or to the anti-lock brakes. They're segmented because of the design that was...
And the safety requirements.
Right, and the safety requirements.
Well, and that's where I think standards are starting to make a difference. We're looking at what are some best practices to implement from an automotive perspective, from a design perspective, and our overall quality, safety, and security perspective. And really one of those drivers are these new manufacturers are coming out. When we talk about what's the next generation of vehicle look like, most people think not GM, not Ford, they think Tesla, or they think some other new automotive disruptor that's coming out with some new types of technologies, new looks to vehicles. And that's where we're really seeing deep integration of different systems and different subcomponents in a vehicle. You mentioned Spotify, and we kind of chuckled about that. But that's just the beginning. When we look at infotainment systems, there's designs that are on the table that don't even have an infotainment system. It's all driven via the phone. So when we think about how that's going to impact the vehicle, how does muting work? How does call forwarding work? How do all these different features that we expect out of a phone, how is that implemented in a vehicle, and how is that implemented for a dispersed provider of cell phone providers? Then we start to see some real challenges there.
And there's a whole alliance around the infotainment system itself, the interactive browser part of it. What's the name of that? Geneva, yes.
Geneva.
And
Geneva, everybody has a different way.
And here you have the Tier 1 and Tier 2 OEMs all participating together, trying to come up with the best practices for the infotainment system in particular.
Right. And it's not just Geneva. There's many of them. We look at automotive-grade Linux, specifically focused on infotainment systems. We look at Geneva for overall systems design and vehicle design from a security perspective. A lot of that information is a proving ground that's being moved into the OEM spaces. And we'll continue to see that. And that's been really one of the beneficial parts of working with these groups, of getting an idea of what are their challenges that they're facing now and how do we grow off of those challenges. Because when we talk about security today, and we've joked about this before, we've talked about this before in other podcasts, when we look at security today, it is not what we're going to be seeing in 10 years.
Right.
Some of it may still be there. I mean, we know that bugs can last for a very long time depending on the operating system and update cycles. But there's going to be new types of attacks. And when we talk about antivirus, that's kind of a joke these days because antivirus really doesn't, you can't keep up with antivirus. You're constantly updating. So we have to look at new techniques now. And what are those techniques going to be? When we have to consider, I have 100,000 vehicles that are all the same make and model that are on the road. And if we find a vulnerability that allows us to attack over the air all those vehicles and disable them all at once, very concerning. How do we start to address those types of issues? So I mentioned OTA, over-the-air updates.
Right.
That's one of those areas that we're really starting to look at. And how do we address the challenges from an automotive and an OEM perspective? Most of us, when we think about a software update, we think about an update that's going to happen to our computer. We apply a patch and we reboot the computer, and that's the end of the day. We hope that that patch get applied properly. But when we look at a vehicle, there's so many interactions between different subsystems. Even though they're from the same OEM, how can I apply those updates? Do I have the space to download that over the air, then apply that update? When do I apply it? Is it while the vehicle's running? Well, now I have to take in safety considerations into play. So it becomes very challenging in that perspective. And one thing we haven't talked about at all is the aftermarket. Many people out there, when they purchase a vehicle, they like to do upgrades.
Right. So today, at security conferences, what you see are researchers attacking the infotainment system in particular. Not surprising, because it's basically a WebKit browser that's being repurposed to do a bunch of different things. And that's where we're looking at today as the entry point. But as you just said, we need to look 5 to 10 years down the road, because as we get these connected cars on the road becomes connected to the automobiles. And there's going to be communication back and forth between the stoplights in your vehicle or other vehicles, vehicle-to-vehicle communications. And so that opens another door of vulnerabilities that will need to be investigated. And since we're 5 years out, we really should be thinking about that today and how we can lock that down with best practices before the vehicle even gets out on the road.
Sure. We should also mention, right now we're talking about a vehicle. In the future, we're going to be seeing what's called training. So we all love it when the semi comes barreling down the road and we're like, oh my gosh, he's right on my tail, I got to get out of the way. In the future, it's very possible you're going to see a semi or some vehicle similar to that, and it's going to have multiple trailers that are attached behind it that are all driven by that very first trailer and controlling it. Same thing we could potentially see from mass transit. We could see that from taxis and other types of vehicles that are out there, in order to reduce that computing power necessary to manage a large number of vehicles, especially when we look at very large, very dense areas like San Francisco, New York City. This is going to become very, very important. And now, as you said, we're bringing in infrastructure.
Right.
Traditionally, again, we have that vehicle that's off on its own. Those days are gone. We have to look at the infrastructure that's supporting the overall autonomous vehicle, V2X, V2V, and also take into account, when we're talking today, we're usually talking about North America, but this is a global issue. We're seeing these very same things. I just came back from a trip from China. Excellent trip, lots of vehicles. And the infrastructure is well prepared for upgrades so that we can see this type of autonomous control. We can see mass transit being much more efficient in these very congested areas.
I do know that in Europe they're already doing that with the trucks. You called it training, where they're looking at the drag to reduce gas usage. So there's some physical results by having these vehicles chained together, and the idea being that they have one driver in the first truck, and the other ones, and the ones are following, basically take their orders from that first truck. And so we're seeing some real-world applications of these ideas. And yeah, the idea of mass transit and taxis is kind of exciting, but at the same time, we're going to have to figure all this out before we really implement that.
Very much so. It's all about standards, right?
Right.
We have to have some robust standards to help address these challenges that we're starting to see. You brought up an interesting factor, which is fuel economy. When we look at autonomous vehicles, almost all of them are hybrids these days, and in some cases they're strictly electric. So we're looking at that transition, but we still have this infrastructure challenge to address. How can I get power charging to be ubiquitous, just like gas stations, for a wide range of vehicles, and to be able to support those communications protocols on how do I charge this particular battery versus a different type of battery in a different type of vehicle. So these are all the things that we're looking at and we're talking about. But again, I think it's important to point out, from an automotive perspective, they are really taking this seriously.
Right.
As a consumer, we should feel pretty good in the aspect that of all the industries that we work with on a regular basis, automotive is really supercharged.
So I've asked you this question before, and I'd like to hear the answer again if you could, and that is, compared to, say, the medical space, how would you compare the automotive industry to the healthcare industry in terms of embracing the need for security?
Right. So, that's an interesting question, and it has changed in a very relatively short period. When we look at a medical device manufacturer, as I indicated, the lead times from design to release are typically pretty long.
But so are automobiles.
So are automobiles.
All right.
So that's that interesting parallel, which is, from a medical device perspective, they're focused on one device. From an automotive perspective, we're looking at a system of systems. And hands down, right now, automotive is far ahead of what medical is doing from a cybersecurity standpoint, even without having the lead time of regulatory requirements, standards development that medical device manufacturers have had for some time. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in the news. We see the impact of that.
Right. So would you think that the automotive response is based on a stunt hack, which captured a lot of imagination, as opposed to, we know some medical devices have failed over time, but those are more quieter attacks. They're not exactly front page news.
Well, I think there's a piece that we don't take into account, and we can draw a parallel to what we do at home. If I'm on my home computer and I'm working on something and the application crashes or the system starts behaving slowly or something just doesn't seem right, what do I typically do? I restart the system. What was the impact? What actually led up to that point? Was it a safety issue? Was it a quality issue? Or was it a security issue? And for the medical industry, we don't know. Those devices can't be tracked. We can't track that information easily. In the automotive industry, we have that ability. We have those vehicles. They have ECUs. Some of them even have black boxes today that help us collect that information and be more robust over time.
Actually, all cars past a certain date have black boxes installed in them. But that brings up another issue, is we're going to have an interim period. And I know in California, you can find a really old car driving down the street just because that's the way it is.
Right.
We're going to have a period where you have these smart cars on the road with legacy cars. And so this is going to fuel a whole aftermarket explosion of tools to make your 65 Mustang smart.
Right.
Foresee any problems with something like that?
Well, there'll be plenty of problems. Obviously, there's going to be a limitation of how smart that vehicle can be, right? But it's going to help. Really, what it'll help address is allowing those smart vehicles to avoid that not as smart vehicle.
Right.
So we'll have some standards that help vehicles negotiate, what do I do with this older vehicle that doesn't behave the way I expect it to? But as you said, that is going to be an aftermarket, and that's going to be a very popular aftermarket. It's going to be quite pervasive for some time. But you brought up another interesting point, which is when I purchase a vehicle, we're talking about classics, right?
Yeah.
Well, how many of us who had that old Honda Civic would consider, 20 years ago, consider that old Honda Civic to be a classic? It is. I mean, by definition, it is a classic. When we start looking at autonomous vehicles and other V2V vehicles as they get older, we have to address a really important challenge, which is end of life of that vehicle. Is it when the warranty expires? Well, traditionally, no. Is it when a serviceable component in that vehicle is no longer available? And I'll give you an example. Maybe I have a wireless unit in that vehicle that manages communications, and now the cryptography is so old or so cumbersome, that vehicle could be used, not necessarily used, but that vehicle could be subverted to act in a way it shouldn't. Does that mean that vehicle has to be taken off the road? So we have a whole new set of challenges that we have to think about and plan for when we talk about obsolescence of a vehicle that just hasn't even been considered or thought about today.
And then we also have the privacy aspect of it.
Very
If
much.
I'm putting Spotify or whatever on my car, it's attached to my account. When I sell that car, what happens to that information? Does the new owner now have access to my account? Do they know my playlist? Do they know where I've gone?
Right.
The same thing with insurance, too. When you buy used cars, the insurance industry is going to be able to see the legacy of that vehicle. There are lots of privacy questions that are coming by having all of this electronics in the vehicle.
Well, especially when you talk about the ability to have something like a Siri or an Alexa in your vehicle. And we've already seen some court cases where records are being requested.
OnStar.
Exactly. So we have this type of a privacy issue that's going to be raised and going to continue to grow in a relatively short period, because we're already seeing a transition to have that. Imagine a vehicle that has some level of AI or machine learning that when you get into the vehicle, it knows your characteristics. It knows how you drive. Can that information be reported? Can it be purged? What happens to that when I sell the vehicle or the vehicle needs to be scrapped because of an accident? Is it scrapped immediately, or does that information need to be recorded somewhere? all questions we're going to have to answer over a period of time, but these are the things that we're talking about working out from a standards perspective and an industry perspective.
And so other than you and I having this conversation, is anybody looking into that?
Very much so. So,
Okay.
in fact, this week I'll be speaking at SAE Connected to Car Symposium, and this is going to be some of the very topics that we discuss. What are the future challenges that we have to think about, and how we are going to be able to address those in a realistic time frame? So, most definitely, this is something that is at the maybe not the foremost of the automotive industry, but from the security and privacy professionals within the automotive industry, this is something we talk about on a regular basis.
Well, I look forward to hearing more about that.
Yeah, very excited about it. So, as always, we thank you guys for joining us. We'll be seeing you at our next podcast, and thank you for attending.
Thank you.